As the winter rolls on, we can expect to see more impacts of climate change. Recent polling from Gallup says black Americans are more vulnerable to extreme weather. 14% of black Americans say they have to relocate because of extreme weather, like hurricanes, wildfires, and tornadoes. That's compared to 8% of white Americans. Black people are less likely to have the resources to relocate. We're also more likely than white Americans to have an impact in our lives because of flooding. And we're more likely to feel less confident that the government, the local government, would properly prepare us for a natural disaster. And let's be clear, climate justice, it's a human right. And tonight, we're talking with one of those women, one of those extraordinary people in the world who's working to make younger generations more passionate about the work to achieve that justice. Joining me now is Leah Thomas. She's an environmental activist. She's also the author of The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. Leah, so good to see you, so good to talk to you. First of all, let me just say thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so important and so under-celebrated. That's why we wanted to have you here on the Griot. Talk to me about intersectional environmentalism. What is it?
Absolutely. Intersectional environmentalism pulls from intersectional theory and just explores how communities of color and low-income communities are more impacted by environmental injustices. So that's everything that you mentioned, like the floods and natural disasters, and also a lack of green spaces, increased air pollution, etc.
That's helpful. So when we say intersectional theory, just from our audience, help them understand what are the things that are intersecting. Like when we say we're dealing with the environment, it's the environment in relationship or in connection to what?
Yeah, so we're looking at the environment and specifically environmental hazards in relationship to race or other identity aspects. And you could also include things like gender and income. But race is the #1 indicator of whether or not someone in the United States is going to experience an environmental hazard or injustice, followed by or sometimes overlapping with income.
Wow, that is powerful. Of course, we read some statistics going into this conversation about that. But for a lot of people, it's hard to wrap their minds around the idea that black people could be more susceptible or more vulnerable to environmental hazard. Since nature is colorblind, the environment is everywhere. What are the circumstances, what are the conditions that lead particular communities to be more vulnerable to, say, climate change or to other kinds of harm?
Yeah, absolutely. As an environmentalist, I'm often met with this question, and people are like, trees are racist, the air is racist. But that's not necessarily the case, but housing discrimination and all of these other things and systemic inequality leads to the communities that are most impacted by social injustice also being impacted by environmental injustice. And a lot of this is a structural issue. So if we're even going back to housing discrimination practices that are quote unquote illegal in our country right now, and redlining and things like that, we see Black communities placed in specific neighborhoods, and those communities are surrounded in what's called a toxic donut. That was a term defined by Hazel M. Johnson, an incredible environmental justice advocate from Chicago, where they have more toxic waste sites, landfills, pollution, highways, etc. So because of structural inequality and racism, we see the Black community and other lower income communities and communities of color surrounded by all sorts of environmental hazards. So the earth is not inherently racist, but a lot of our structural and housing and those sorts of policies are.
So there's been a lot of talk in the UN about protecting African countries as well as the Caribbean from climate change. But are you hearing about U.S. Black communities? Oftentimes we seem to get just kind of mixed into the American messiness. And so it's like America needs help. But no, Black folk in particular, our communities need targeted help. Is that part of the global conversation?
It is, but I think oftentimes people are focusing on things like the carbon in the atmosphere or the changing temperatures and kind of like a hypothetical future that might happen instead of focusing on the urgency of the present, like you just mentioned. There are so many Black folks around the United States. Even just look at what happened after Katrina, where white communities in New Orleans ended up getting richer and those with resources already walked away with more resources, and yet the Black and low-income community after the disaster ended up with less resources. So it's really important to focus on communities that are being impacted right now and not just the hypothetical future of what could happen in the future, because there are so many communities with a lack of tree coverage, with a lack of food, water, look at Flint, etc. So it's being talked about a little bit more because of so many environmental justice organizers in the United States, but it's not getting the attention that it deserves.
So speaking of the right now of this, the urgency of it, there are people who are saying, well, what can we do? How can we protect the environment right now? We don't want to be completely beholden to the UN or to these sort of nonprofits or to these NGOs. Like, what can people do right now to protect the environment?
Not to sound like a hippie, but the best thing that you can do is support your local economy and also support those local grassroots environmental organizations. Because I will say bureaucracy is really slow and sometimes federal or international changes feel like they take forever. But there are people in your community right now that are planting trees, cultivating community gardens, and fighting the fight. So I would say research environmental justice organization, insert your city, find those people, get involved, because you can see those community-based changes scale. And I would say support your local economy, support local farmers, farmers markets, and things like that. That has a tremendous impact.
Everybody, Leah Thomas is an environmentalist and author of The Intersectional Environmentalist, How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. Leah, thanks so much for joining me. Everybody, make sure you grab that book and tap in with the work that Leah is doing by going to leahthomas.com.